We at ECIPE have this series of Tumlir lectures in order to serve as a platform for a dialogue about what the world trading system and its current direction needs in order to make itself relevant and to respond to the problems that are facing governments around the world today. And as you can see, we are very selective in our choices of lecturers, and we choose people that combine many different virtues that we like, especially intellectual quality, solid experience, and a record of promoting the role of the multilateral trading system. So in a way, you can call this ECIPE's equivalent to the Oscar Lifetime Achievement Award. And it's with great pleasure and honor for us that I now would like to introduce to you our third Jan Tumlir lecturer, Mr. Pascal Lamy, a lecturer that exactly fits the profile of this lecture series.
In a nutshell, I will argue in the following remarks that we are transitioning from an old world of trade to a new world of trade. And in this new world of trade, trade opening is a very different game. And this revolution has major consequences which will have to, and hopefully will, impact the international trading system, whether in terms of principles or in terms of policy and even mandates, as evidenced, for instance, by the turbulent recent start of the so-called TTIP. Now, to put it simply, at the risk of some simplification, the old world of trade was a world where production systems were national and where obstacles to trade were about protecting domestic producers from foreign competition. That's the old world. By contrast, the new world is a world where production is transnational, global supply chains, trade made of a vast majority of components, whether goods or services, and where obstacles to trade are now about protecting not the producer, but the consumer. So we are not yet totally out of the old world, we are not totally yet in the new world. We are somewhere in between. We are moving from the administration of protection, tariffs, subsidies, to the administration of precaution, security, safety, health, and so on. This old distinction, which I think remained roughly true, although with important qualifications between tariff measures and non-tariff measures. Now, in this new world, a few elements of the old world do not change. The first one being that opening trade, i.e. reducing obstacles to trade, restrictions to trade, works for growth and welfare. And on this I would 100% agree with Jan Tumlir. Although my own view has been for a long time that it only works under some conditions. Creating economic gains is one thing, creating social gains is another thing, and I have insisted on this difference in this book I published just after I left WTO, which I entitled the Geneva Consensus. The Geneva Consensus meaning that, yes, you have to open trade, but you also have to take a lot of care of the sort of Ricardo-Schumpeterian impact this has on economic and social fabrics. But in this new world, it remains true that opening trade, because it creates efficiencies, is the road to follow. The second thing that doesn't change in this new world, as compared to the old world, is that opening trade, i.e. reducing obstacles to trade, is about leveling the playing field and doing this in a predictable way, back to Jan Tumlir's fundamental institutional approach about the value of predictability for economic agents. So that's what doesn't change. Now, what changes? Well, what changes fundamentally is the way to level the playing field. You don't level the playing field the same way in protection or in precaution. Leveling the playing field in protection is fairly simple. Downwards, zero. The mental horizon of all the tariff negotiators has always been zero, as long as there's nothing like a negative tariff, import tariff in economic theory, so far at least. So, the system is very simple. You get rid of the measure, you reduce them, you kill them. In the world of precaution, it's a totally different ballgame. If a European Commissioner goes to the European Parliament and says, ladies and gentlemen, I'm in favor of opening trade. And for the sake of opening trade in flowers, because that's a great thing where comparative advantages work a lot, notably for our African friends, I have decided to submit to you that we will have a different maximum pesticide residue for flowers coming from Rwanda, because it's a poor country, from Costa Rica, because it's a middle-income country, and for Israel, because it's a developed country. That will not work. I'll come back to that in a minute. What you used to do with tariff, you cannot do with standard certification, conformity assessment processes. You cannot handle non-tariff measures the way you handle tariff measures. And this is where trade economists who have for a long time, and rightly so, tried to assess the impact of non-trade measures as tariff equivalents, get it wrong. Most of non-tariff measures, with some nuances, are not about substituting tariffs. Most of precaution measures are not substitutes to former protection measures. And what matters in the administration of precaution is not to get rid of the measure, not to kill the measure, not to reduce the measure, but to reduce differences between various systems of precaution administration. So, it's a very different thing. In the old world, getting rid of the measure. In the new world, getting rid of the differences in the measure, which by themselves constitutes obstacle to trade and increase the cost of trade, not least, and I'll come back to that later, because the cost of compliance with diverse regulatory systems and prescriptions. And that's, in some way, an evolution, a transition, which we know in Europe, and which basically was the difference between the common market and the internal market. In many ways, the common market was a free trade zone, no tariffs, no anti-dumping, a severe control of subsidies, the purpose of which is to protect, like tariffs, domestic producers from foreign competition, but a process of regulatory harmonization so that what limited the common market in terms of economies of scale would happen with a single market, hence this whole enterprise of regulatory convergence, whether harmonization, mutual recognitions, and we know there are various technologies to do that. So, opening trade has, in many ways, a different purpose. Opening trade in this new world also has a different political economy. In the old world, when I was a tariff negotiator, I knew my political equation. I had consumers with me, dormant, silent, and I had producers against me who were screaming at increased competition on their domestic market, which is why I always advise any minister having political ambitions to start with trade. It's a killer for a political career for this specific reason. Now, in the new world of trade, the political economy is upside down. If I'm in the business of regulatory convergence, I have producers with me because they are appetized by the notion that if there's a single standard, they will catch the effect of the economy of scale, and rightly so, because if you remove the difference between two standards, you level the playing field, hence provide the sort of efficiencies which trade economists have demonstrated for a long time. But the price for that is that I have consumers against me. Or more precisely, I have organizations that speak for the consumers. There's nothing like the referendum with consumers, which are consumer organizations against me. Why? Simply because the business of a consumer organization is to convince the people, its members, its followers, as we say now with Facebook, that if they weren't doing their job, then the people would be at risk. So they are about protecting the consumer, which is about the level of precaution. And if I start discussing with a trade partner anywhere on this planet about these standards, if my narrative is the purpose is to level the playing field, immediately the reaction will be, hey, danger. They are going to do this downwards. It's my level of precaution, my level of safety, the one I care about, which is going to be at stake. So my reaction, because precaution is about risk management, my reaction will be, hey, stop. I don't want anything that will run the risk of diminishing my level of, let's say, risk comfort, which is another way of talking about precaution. And of course, this creates a totally different political game. Because in the previous world, consumers were for you, but roughly silent and dormant. In the new world of trade, they become very vocal. And that creates political turbulences, which, for the reasons I gave, are absolutely inevitable. And this is all the more of a potential problem that tariffs were roughly ideologically neutral. If I exchange my tariff on bicycles against your tariff on scrap metal, we all know what we're talking about. Bicycles are the same all over the planet, and scrap metal is the same all over the planet. It's ideologically flat. If you enter the realm of precaution, you enter a non-flat realm. Precaution is ideologically different, depending on cultures, history, religion. Think about not only safety of lighters or toys or cars, which is, let's say, probably ideologically relatively neutral, or at least reasonably science-based. Think about animal welfare. Think about GMOs. Think about data privacy. So it's not only that it's different, but the sensitivity is extremely different, and the challenge of leveling the playing field within a range of risks is value connected. After all, what is a risk? A risk is something that's worse than a not risk. And this has to do, at the end of the day, with good and bad. And good and bad is something which, within humanity, is a spectrum of preferences which is extremely wide. Now, what also changes, on a bit more operational side in this new world, purpose changes, the political enemy changes, the actors change. If it's about harmonizing pesticide residues, maximum, which, by the way, is not only a great thing for, let's say, the two partners that do that, but also for exporters to this enlarged market. If I'm a London producer of flowers, I will wish that US, EU, and if possible Japan, have the same maximum pesticide residue standard. As long as they don't have one, I have to adjust to different certification processes, which are costly, and I cannot do the economies of scale because I have to segregate my exports as a function of the market of destination. But it's not going to be trade negotiators who are going to adjust the proper level of maximum pesticide residues in flowers. This will be done by experts who are experts of the impact of pesticide on human health. And they're not at DG Trade, and I can tell you they're not either in the WTO Secretariat. But yet, this impulse is driven in the name of opening trade. So it opens a whole bunch of questions, notably because the agencies who are responsible for these regulations are a myriad. They usually have become more and more independent from political power, for reasons of conflict of interest. And by the way, many of the standards that matter for the producer are private standards. Tariffs are public, because for extraordinary reasons, sovereigns have maintained the right to tax something at the border. So it's sovereigns that negotiate tariffs, it's sovereigns that sign treaties that reduce tariffs or subsidies. but it's not sovereigns, in many cases, that decide on the proper level of pesticide residues for flowers. It's private companies. There is something like a multilateral pesticide residue standard somewhere in the international system. But if I am Tesco and I want to compete with Harold or Carrefour and get more consumers on my side of the streets because I'm greener, I will sign a specific charter with a local consumer organization, according to which I apply a higher level of precaution than the public standard. If I'm a London producer of flowers, whether it's public or private, doesn't matter a minute. What matters is where do I sell my flowers with which standard. So, on top of having the sort of usual Westphalian problem of these 200 molecules converging to something, and that's already a bit of a challenge in itself, you enter another world, which is the world of private companies who are de facto, largely now, prescribers of the proper level of precaution. So, different purpose, different politics, different actors. All this has, in my view, major consequences on a number of principles who have been, for a long time, stabilized in the international trading system. Now, not from the very beginning, not from the moment the King of Crete signed the first treaty of commerce with the Pharaoh of Egypt. At the time, the thing was not really institutionalized, it wasn't really solid, it didn't work with principles, but little by little, and notably, of course, with the GATT and then the WTO, a number of ideological pillars were built upon which the edifice was relying. For instance, preferences. Lots of that in the Old World. A huge debate whether preferences were right or wrong. Wrong because they are not MFN. Right because they can be stepping stones. Article 24, GATT, WTO, its interpretation. In the New World, no more preferences. Precaution is in itself MFN. No discrimination. As long, of course, as I apply the same standard to my domestic production as I apply it to my imports, which, by the way, was already the rule in the GATT and WTO, hence the principles which were enshrined, for instance, in the SPS and in the TBT agreement. But precaution is MFN. This shakes and probably destroys the SND pillar, to talk WTO jargon, as I already mentioned in my examples of flowers from Rwanda, Costa Rica, or Israel. Special beneficial treatment, which is a trade system which is sort of nicer to poorer countries because their ability to compete is not there as long as they haven't built the proper supply side and so on. SND dead. And that's a big pillar. It also, in a way, changes fundamentally the notion of reciprocity. In the Old World, the whole point of a trade negotiation was putting a price on a kilo of scrap metal as compared to a kilo of bicycles. The whole purpose of the negotiation was the valuation of this trade-off. And it was a trade-off. I would give you something, and in return, you would give me something. Great thing was that if we both lower our tariff, it's a win-win, but that doesn't suffice to finish a trade negotiation, as we all know, as long as the exact weighting of the value of a kilo of scrap metal is not agreed as per a kilo of bicycles. This is not the case anymore in the new world of trade. First, because there's nothing like a trade-off. I'm not going to take your safety standard on lighters for the exchange, and you will take my safety standard on toys. It may make sense intellectually, will never work politically. Precaution is not something you trade off. Precaution is something which may try to harmonize in reducing not only the level of precaution, which is one thing, but as importantly for people who produce, and again this is true for goods as it is for services, the way this level of precaution is administered. If you take, and I'll come back to that in a moment, if you take US and EU, for instance, in 1/3 of the cases, EU is higher in precaution than the US. In 1/3 of the cases, US is higher than the EU in precaution, contrary to conventional wisdom in Europe. And in 1/3 of the cases, the level of precaution is the same, but the way it is administered is so different on each side that it's as if it was a different level. And this, of course, has to do, for instance, with conformity assessment, with certification procedures, and the rest. So, reciprocity is not about a kilo of something properly valued against a kilo of something else properly valued. It's about something which is much more complex, which is equivalence in precaution. Just these few elements which differ fundamentally from a number of principles on which multilateral or international trade negotiations, whether bilateral, regional, or multilateral, have been handled, shows that we definitely are in a different set of principles. Now, before I conclude, let me now look briefly at what I believe this evolution or revolution implies in policy and institutional terms for the international trading system, thus rejoining the basic purpose of your young Tumlir lectures. I think it implies differences in mostly two areas. Number one, change of focus. And number two, possible changes in mandates. Now, starting with a change of focus, if I take an ultra-simplified view of obstacle to trade in the world of today, average, i.e. I'm a virtual average exporter, and I want to step in the global market. What is the present topography of obstacle to trade, measured by their cost. It's 5, 10, 20. 5 is the trade-weighted average tariff today, worldwide. 10 is the cost of administration of borders, which is what, as an exporter or as an importer, doesn't matter which side is the cost. At the end of the day, the consumer pays that cost. I have to pay 10% of the value of the trade that crosses the border. This is, by the way, true for goods, not for services, as we all know. So 5, 10, and 20. And the 20 is about addressing regulatory discrepancies. A, because, as I already said, it has a cost. If I export flowers from Rwanda to the US, I need a certification by the US competent agency. And this certification will cost me roughly $50,000 a year, which, if I'm a Rwandan producer of flowers, is quite a lot. On top of that, which is the cost of administration which these certification precaution agencies bill the exporter that wants to be cleared to enter the market, I have the sort of the diseconomies of scale of having to adjust my production to 3, 4 different systems. On this one anecdote, when I was DG of WTO, I had taken the habit of going to check on the ground how this was working. Fun to be in a bubble somewhere in Geneva, but sometimes have to go back to reality. And I was visited in Minneapolis, a famous company, I'll give a name, who is specialized in producing chips, medical chips. You've got a problem in your brain, in your kidney, in your heart, you implant a chip, and it fixes your problem with your brain, your kidney, and your heart. Great thing. Average price of these devices, $5,000. And I visited them in the morning, and then I asked them, what would be the cost in this utopian situation where there would be one worldwide system for authorizing your chips into any market? Ooh, that's a difficult question, but then it's a good question. So we will put our experts at work, our engineers, our lawyers, and we'll give you an answer to this question in a fortnight. A fortnight later, I received an email, very nice. We did the job, we did our numbers. Today, we have to cope with 48 different systems of certification of our medical chips. And understandably, this is a highly regulated field. I'm not going to accept that anybody puts any chip in the brain or the kidney of somebody. So we have 48 systems. If we had one, the average cost of our device would go down from $5,000 to $3,000. Lawyers' fees, engineering, checks, the whole paperwork. And I was struck by this example, because getting such a price reduction on things which are so essential, for people, for health, is, I think, extremely striking. Now, so 5, 10, 20. I don't promise that my 20 is a perfectly scientific number, but that's the order of magnitude. Now, if you look at where trade negotiators are focused on for the moment, They spend 80% of their time on the 5%. They spend 10% of their time on the 20%. And they did spend, thanks God, and after many, many years of hesitation, quite a bit of time on the 10%, which led to the Bali Agreement on trade facilitation. I will write when I really retire. I don't intend anymore to go out of my house. That probably will be killed. The time, efforts, strategies, tactics it took for these highly intelligent trade diplomats to get to grips with the nitty-gritty of customs procedures. Moving from the deck to the machine room, and I know that as a former Navy officer, is sometimes a huge travel, which entails getting really dirty. Now, thanks God again, these 10% will probably be 5% 10 years from now, which is great news. Great news. And which probably is the reason why in the complex agenda that are around, trade facilitation, which was bottom of the basket when we launched it in 2001, progressively climbed up to be the number one. Because it's the only topic where people who trade want to reduce obstacles to trade, to make more business, and trade negotiators were thinking about the same thing. And in a way, it shows also, probably, the way forward if you want to get things done. So, in a nutshell, the focus has to change from what doesn't really matter to what really matters. And I happen to believe, not that again we are totally out of the old world, that 5% is an average. We all know that an average is totally meaningless as far as tariff is concerned, that what matters is tariff peaks, and that the capacity of tariff peak to fluctuate is exponential as per the capacity of low tariff to obstruct trade. But what matters a lot with the 20%, on top of this general reasoning, the 5% usually is at valorem. Now, the 20% is not at valorem. The 20% usually is fixed costs. You pay your certification once, and whether you export 20 flowers, 1 ton or 10 tons of flowers, you have the same cost. Which means that the impact of these regulatory discrepancies on access to trade is incredibly unfair, because big companies can pay this sort of entry ticket, but small business very often cannot. So the potential of addressing these 20% in terms of opening trade, i.e. allowing a number of businesses to step in this game, whereas for the moment they haven't, is much bigger than an ad valorem device like tariff. So, change of focus. Another area where I think focus will have to change is this whole bunch of extra WTO issues. I say extra, it's a sort of conventional vocabulary. You've got WTO standard, W plus, and WTO extra. W extra being investment, competition, taxation, which are issues which inevitably, in my view, the expansion of global supply chain will connect more and more with trade. I mean, we've all known in trade economy that investment and trade are sometimes the two faces of the same coin. But what this expansion of global supply chain shows is that these linkages between investment and trade flows, the capacity of these global value chains to offer what the OECD diplomatically calls excessive tax optimization. Excessive tax optimization. You have to be a diplomat to invent such a nice concept. Or even competition issues is much bigger. Because the absence of harmonization or similar standards along global value chain, if something is produced in 10 different countries, is much more of a problem than in the old world of trade. Now, again, whether you do that bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally, remains an open question. It, of course, changes a lot the sequence of trade opening as part of regional integration processes. If I take the example of ASEAN, or Central America, or Eastern Africa, which are probably the 3 places on this planet where regional integration is really happening through trade integration, getting the sequence right in the new world is crucial. And getting the sequence right in the new world is very different from the old world. I don't think it makes any sense to spend hours and months and years for the Eastern African community or the Central American community or the ASEAN on a common custom tariff for cars. But adopting an airspace administration system that allocates air slots regionally, or adopting a common regulation for medicines marketing, for instance, to take my other example, makes a lot of sense because the benefits to the consumer are enormous and usually very rapid. So the sort of eternal strategic and tactical problem in trade integration, what's the low-hanging fruit and what's the high-hanging fruit, and don't spend too much time about high-hanging fruit. Start with the ones that you can get soon. What's on the different level of the tree is very different in the old world and in the new world. And I think a number of these integration processes have not yet totally grasped this difference. What's behind this issue of how to globalize precaution and the way you administer it, in my view, is a fundamental problem ahead for market capitalism, which in a way might, and this is the optimistic scenario, you always have to end on an optimistic scenario, which might, in a way, lead global market capitalism to address issues which it has poorly addressed so far, which is values. The old Polanyi issue of how much you need to embed economic systems and social systems, political systems, which so far we've had a huge economic integration on the contemporization of technology, and this will go on in my view. But in many areas we haven't addressed what really divides us, which has to do with not the realities of rational market prices, supply, demand, volume, but the passion of imagination, representation, dreams, nightmares, hopes, fears. And the world we are entering in, if we want to keep reducing obstacles to trade, is a world like that. And this, I think, has a lot to do with reconnecting the globalization process with domestic politics, with domestic legitimization processes. And I will end by quoting Jan Tumlir on this issue, and I quote him, the problem of the international order is not essentially an international problem. The difficulty, rather, is that virtually all the core countries are passing through a difficult crisis of democratic home governance. Jan Tumlir wrote this in the 1960s. I think 50 years later, we can definitely agree that Jan Tumlir was of a rare kind of economist, those who are able to predict the future.
I would like to add two things, one very quickly and the other one a little bit longer. Pascal focused on trade, and that was the terms of reference. But I have to add one thing, which is really the environment of trade. An international environment is really different today from the international environment of the 60s to the 2000s. Basically, from the 60s to 2000, you have a fixed game between the US and the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was a kind of defensive, static position, and nothing really was in a real danger. Today, definitively, there are countries which don't want to play the game in political matters, but of course that has consequences on trade. And I don't want to quote all these countries, you know by heart all these countries. So that's changed the game, because then for the trade people it's made the game much more difficult, the situation much more difficult. But the more important aspect I would like to add is, following Jan Tumlir, the domestic situation, especially the domestic situation of the democracies. The democratic system is weakened. It is much more difficult to be a president or prime minister or chancellor today than it was to be in the 60s or the 70s. I give you a few figures. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, and of course that was really the emergence of the GATT and the modern system of GATT, basically most of the government of the US, France, UK, and Germany govern with something like 55 to 65% of votes as a supporter. They have a relatively comfortable majority in terms of voters and in terms of seats in the National Assembly. Then in the 90s, this 60% average came down to 55%. So the majority was shrinking, and for the four countries, almost at the same time. Today, the majority is 51%, 52%. So basically, for us trade people, it means that the prime minister or president is much more concerned by small lobbies. And of course, the trade field is just a field of maneuver of all the lobbies that you can imagine. And the smaller can have a much bigger power today than in the 60s, in the 70s. You know, I always use this example. President Reagan, his second presidency was elected by 95% of the electoral core, the electoral people. So, you know, a small lobby could come and President Reagan could come, who are you? And that was it. Today, it's not at all the same thing. So that's a completely different aspect, and of course that reinforced Jan Tumlir concerns about the rule of law, the principles, because it makes the government much more keen to follow exemption, and so forth. It's not trade which has created that, I think. Really what happened is today, this is the technology which has invented that, and especially internet. Internet makes a very small lobby extremely powerful. And I think we have to learn how to use and to take into account internet. May I take the consultancy by the EU Commission on the ISDS? To do such kind of consultation was really a big risk, and the risk has been certain. Friday I was with somebody from ATTAC besides me. I mentioned that 147,000 of this 150,000 proposal, suggestion by the people were in fact run computer, and the guy from ATTAC was quite silent. Of course, it was his computer, it was part of it. So we have to be very careful. The game has changed domestically, and again, an international problem. You mentioned that, Pascal, several times. And international issues, international conflicts are reflected by domestic conflicts and domestic issues. The second point I was to mention is that I fully agree with you about tariff, but we have to take into account that they still have to have some tariff. And in fact, in CETA, as far as I understand, we have killed each other for 1 year and a half about some tariff, if I understand well. TPP is a question of tariff in all the directions, and they negotiate only on that, maybe by despair, because they wanted to do the first 21st century treaty, but they are still back in the tariff. And I think one aspect of the tariff I want to mention is that we tend to solve the problem by putting quota tariff rate. And that is the worst system that you could imagine. A quota tariff, let me take the example of the beef, Canada, EU. The Canadians had got 50,000 tons of beef as a quota tariff. It means that there are 10 farmers in Canada. They are so powerful, these 10 farmers, to get this 50 quota on which we have fought for so many months. And that will not change, of course, the price of the beef in Europe, which is the consumption is 8 million of tons, as far as I remember. So the consumer has nothing, and the producers get rents. The few producers get rents. And these few producers will fight against any improvement of the CETA in the future, because, of course, their rents will be at stake. So we are creating, in fact, an anti-free trade mechanism in many of these treatment of tariff. I think that's an important point to mention. Third, and I really like your point of semantics. We have really to be extremely careful about semantics because the world has changed so much. There is two gaps which are really increasing tremendously these years compared to 10 years ago. The first is between the political discourse and the reality, political reality. The political discourse, we need an ambitious trade agreement. My advice to the next trade generation and next trade negotiation, put a sort of list of terms to forget. Ambitious should never be mentioned by a trade negotiator. It's not adapted to this kind of world that you mentioned. Right? This word means living agreement, progressive agreement, what we have done during the last 30 years, 40 years within the EU. And of course, to say ambitious when we have these tiny majorities, government and majorities, is just, the distance between the terms and the political reality is absolutely huge, much bigger than before. The second is the distance between the complexity of the negotiations and the information. You mentioned several times transparency. I think a word that we should push is just information. Instead of making a consultation on ISDS, we should have put the number of ISDS cases, who is lodging that, which firms, against which state. Well, finally, the EU member states went through this ISDS very well, thank you very much. So, and we are the first to complain. And when I mentioned that, 1 month ago in front of an audience of 50 directors of the legal affairs of the 50 large enterprise in Paris, nobody knew about this fact on the ISDS. Nobody. So that's really, Commission should really calm down the language and beef up the information. That's absolutely clear. In fact, it's coming, I think. Now, the last point is about the negotiation. I like to use the term negotiating technology. We took 2 centuries almost to negotiate on tariff. It was not easy. And we made a lot of mistakes during these 200 years. And it's now we have another animal, and you mentioned how difficult is the new animal, which is regulations. So we have to learn the negotiating technology in terms of regulation. And I like your terms, we should not talk negotiating. We should talk about discussions on regulation, or, any term. I mean, I don't want to suggest what I mean, anything except negotiations, because that's the importance of the semantics. Now, one point I would like to start, and I make many relationship with the EU, is that one word that we should avoid is harmonization. Because at the world level, harmonization will be a very rare case. We will have maybe harmonization with the Japanese on car norms, but we will not have harmonization with the Americans on car norms, and so forth. So in fact, harmonization is something which is really a tiny option. In fact, we have an example that I always like to present here, is that we have an harmonized system in norms in cars, And last year or 2 years ago, one car maker, Daimler, decided not to apply the norm, the EU norm. And he did it for exactly the reason you mentioned, because Daimler say, this is maybe less polluting, but it is more dangerous for my drivers because the new pollutant will take far easier. And the person who is responsible is not the people who are made the norms, this is the Daimler. So in some sense, harmonization is not the game except in very specific situations. And regulatory convergence is probably not exactly the game either, because in some sense Daimler is a kind of regulatory divergence, simply because now the cars are so different between the small cars and the large cars that the norms for the small cars are not necessarily the same as the norms for the large car. We have to be more flexible, that's the new world in terms of regulation. And finally, harmonization, of course, this is a good source of anxiety. Harmonize to whom? You say producers are like this stuff. Yes, producers like harmonization to their own norms. But it's clear that the others should harmonize, not me, because of course I have an advantage. So for many reasons, harmonization is dangerous. Mutual recognition is a kind of bizarre element. So I will really push for a name, a word. I mean, maybe there is maybe better words, but I think they are so close. And you mentioned several times equivalence. And this is in the TTIP now, beginning to surface. Your regulation is different than mine, if maybe they are equivalent in terms of impact. So then I accept this regulation and you accept mine. This is the level of definition of norms, and they have also to look at the level of the certification, the two levels, the norms and the certification. And in fact, now the website of the Commission, you have a nice 15-page, absolutely boring, but I am like, for Krugman, boring banking, and we like trade policy to become boring. Again, boring, so that nobody will talk about trade, and that we could really work very, very nicely. And this is the example of seatbelts. You have 15 pages on how the US seatbelts are equivalent than the EU seatbelt. Well, it looks bizarre, it looks ridiculously small, but in fact it's a review of the norms. You know, with the other reviewer, the other country is the reviewer of the quality of the norms. It's an impact assessment without the name, but a very tough impact assessment because it's not yourself who looks at your norms, but this is the other partners. And I think the fact that it's so small, we should, maybe this is because I am old, so I have an advantage over everybody here. I remember I was really interested in trade politics when I was invited in British Columbia at Vancouver, and then I bumped on a book which is the Egg Marketing Board in British Columbia. And it was an economic analysis of the Egg Marketing Board in British Columbia. And of course the conclusions say we should be very careful, the costs are much higher than the benefits, and then we should open British Columbia to Canada. That was a big step. And I think we have to go back. This is really a new world in which, in some sense, we find for the new topics services, of course, not eggs, hopefully, but for new topics we have exactly the same kind of issues. And as you say, then the people in the driving seat are not the trade people, they are the regulators. And in fact, the regulators, I talk now more and more to them, and they are more and more conscious on what they should do. And in fact, in the idea that the regulators is necessarily protectionist, I think it's a prejudice. That has to be proved. Now, when you do that, when you have the US and the EU evaluating their own regulations, and at the end say, okay, I consider your regulation as good as mine, and vice versa, then okay, equivalence. Then you have a virtuous circle that you are mentioning. I really fully agree with you. All this business will go towards virtuous regulation. Why? Because then the US regulators will be the guardian of the quality of the regulations of the EU. If the EU change the regulations and cut down the regulation, the quality of the regulation, the US regulator will say, no, now you are no more equivalent to me. So in some sense, the only way for each partner to change the regulations is in fact to improve the regulation. The only way to change is to improve. It's not to cut. And then I think we have, by definition, we go back slowly, without saying anything, to the multilateral trade system, as you mentioned. It's just leading by example that the others will join you and say, oh, maybe the EU regulations are the best, so I align my own regulation. If I am a poor country or a small country, I align my regulation to the EU. So I think that's my main comments, but I just want to stress again how I enjoy your speech and how I really feel that you are really at the core of the issues of the next 20 years. It will take a long time to really cope with all these issues because it's not easy, not at all. Thank you very much.
On Patrick Mersalin's points, I would certainly agree with you, Patrick, that being in government today is much more difficult than decades ago, simply because legitimacy is harder to build. But I happen to believe that this is for good reasons, not for bad reasons. Legitimacy is more difficult to build because people are freer, they are more educated, they don't follow instructions the way they used to do it. Basically, there's a lot of ignorance. And I think it's a positive development. After all school political liberalism, and I'm a political liberal, I'm not totally the young Tumlir-like in economy, as you know, but I think it's about empowering people, it's about freedom, it's about dignity, it's about individuals having their say in their life. So I think it's a good development. I don't regret it, although I would agree very much with you on the sort of diagnosis that it's much more difficult to do now. On the international environment, I'm not sure I would agree with you. If you look at the troublemakers, if you look at conflict zones on this planet, they were in the past, and they remain today, places where there's very little trade. Now, not that I 100% agree with Montesquieu, who said that where trade crosses border, armies don't cross border anymore. I think it's a bit of a generalization. But I'll give you just one anecdote. I have a very good friend of mine, who many of you know, who's Tariffs, who is the boss of the UNHCR in Geneva, refugees. And we've been working on lots of things together for a long time, and we had taken the habit, sort of every 1 year, to compare our maps. My map of the world with where I had members and where I had no members. So my clients and where I had no clients. And he would show me his map where he had no clients and where he had clients. And where I had no clients was where 80% of his clients were. This sort of arch which starts from Afghanistan, goes down to Iran, then the Middle East, and then the Eastern Horn of Africa. That's no coincidence. On tariffs, I will repeat that several times. Of course, I was trying to look ahead in the future. There remain tariffs, and as I said, peak tariffs sometimes are a serious problem. But long term, I believe tariffs are dead. They are like the light of these stars, which you can see, but the star died decades ago, but the time it takes for the light to get to your eye, because it's very far away, you still see them. But tariffs are dead. And why are tariffs dead? Because the import content of exports keeps growing. Rough numbers, 20 years ago, the average import content of export worldwide was 20%. Today, it's 60%, it's 40%, and 20 years from now, it's going to be 60%. So, when the largest part of what you export are imports to which you add value, shooting on your imports makes absolutely no sense. It becomes simply stupid. Not because you have to abide to discipline. There is something better than discipline, which is good sense. It doesn't make sense anymore, unless you really want to deteriorate the competitiveness of your exports. But that's a difficult case to make. So, as globalization and the interconnection of production systems, again, both for goods and for services, keeps growing under the force of technology, which crushes the cost of distance, which was what limited the impact of Smith and Ricardo. I mean, these guys probably never dreamed that the theory they wrote would ever have such a operational implementation, because in their mind the distance was still a big issue. Well, it just happened that technology kills distance. So, in this sense, TPP is an old negotiation. We all know that TPP will be concluded or not, depending on the US-Japan negotiation, as you said, Patrick, about beef quotas, rice, and a bit of car distribution, which was the US-Japan agenda in the 1970s. It was already about beef quotas, rice, and car distribution. On the negotiating technology, I 100% agree with you. It's a sort of conversation, as the Americans would say. It has a different meaning in French, but it's about a conversation which has to do with collective preferences. On harmonization, I'm not sure I would agree with you. First, because the problem is not small car versus large cars. Of course, small cars are different standards than big cars. It's having the same standards for small cars and big cars on both sides of the Atlantic and preferably elsewhere. So it's not uniformization at all, but it's convergence. Harmonization and mutual recognition, of course, in many ways, mutual recognition is easier, although it's not always true, because, again, the cost of making sure that you follow the same process may be high, but what differs a lot is the impact on third countries. If I'm a Turk, or a Swiss, or a Norwegian, I prefer US and EU to harmonize, because I know the standard, and I will know it in advance, and I will have time to adjust. If it's about mutual recognition, it's a different ball game. If I'm a Swiss, I will have to show to either US or EU, or both, that my own standard can be mutually recognized. And this will take time, and this will be a long process, and maybe the US or the EU regulator will be less inclined to show goodwill to the Swiss or the Norwegian or the Turk, and same for the US with Canada and Mexico. So there are operational things which you need to think about. Producers, Patrick, I'm more optimistic about producers. If I discuss with both sides, EU, US, car, pharmaceutical, chemicals, food, to take this for example, and I ask the question, what's your trade-off between a slightly higher level of precaution, which would entail a cost for you, and the impact in economies of scale on your bottom line? 100% of the answers are, I accept a cost which is moving up to the US or to the EU level, and the impact on my bottom line is positive because the volumes I get amply compensate the extra cost I have to spend to match a higher level of precaution, at least in these areas. Now, I'm not sure about others because I haven't looked at the numbers. On the regulatory mandate for WTO, let me be clear. I don't suggest WTO is given a mandate to regulate precaution. I suggest WTO is given a mandate to monitor the regulation of precaution with a view of ensuring some sort of convergence. So it's monitoring, it's not regulating, it's not going to be dispute settlement. By the way, dispute settlement in WTO is extremely important because it tells you where the border between precaution and protection is. The SPS and the TBT agreements are not about technical regulation. They are about principle, and they basically establish that if you obstruct trade for the sake of precaution, there has to be a proper proportion between precaution and protection.